A 10-year-old boy with severe burns on his arms breaks a window to escape with his crying 3-year-old sister during the night. When a passing driver stops to help the bleeding children, the photos on the boy's hidden phone make him lock his car doors and call 911. The November evening settled over Millbrook, Connecticut like a heavy blanket, carrying with it the sharp bite of approaching winter and the promise of snow that would soon transform the small New England town into a picture postcard of suburban tranquility. Fallen leaves created a patchwork of amber, crimson, and burnt orange across the small front yard of the Harper household, their crisp edges catching the amber glow of the streetlights that had just flickered to life in the gathering. Dusk. The old oak tree that dominated the corner of the yard stood sentinel against the darkening sky, its gnarled branches reaching toward the first stars like arthritic fingers grasping for something forever out of reach. From the outside, the modest two-story colonial home appeared unremarkably ordinary. White aluminum siding slightly weathered by decades of harsh New England winters, black shutters that had seen better days and bore the scars of countless storms, and a small, concrete porch where a forgotten pink tricycle sat gathering the season's first frost. The front walkway, cracked and uneven from years of freeze-thaw cycles, led to a red front door that had once been cheerful but now seemed to sag on its hinges, like a mouth set in permanent resignation. A row of dying mums in plastic pots lined the porch steps, their bronze and yellow blooms wilted and blackened by the recent cold snap. Forgotten casualties in a household where survival took precedence over beauty. But inside the walls of 247 Maple Street, 10-year-old Benjamin Harper knew with the bitter wisdom of a child forced to grow up too fast that appearances could be devastatingly, lethally deceptive. Ben sat at the scratched wooden kitchen table, his thin frame hunched over a Disney princess coloring book that belonged to his 3-year-old half-sister, Luna. The table itself told a story of violence barely contained. Stains from countless beer bottles, burn marks from carelessly placed cigarettes, and a long gouge near the edge where Derek had once slammed down a knife with enough force to split the wood. Ben's sandy brown hair, in desperate need of a cut, fell across his forehead in uneven waves as he carefully guided Luna's small, chubby hand holding a purple crayon, helping her stay within the lines of Cinderella's elaborate ball gown. The sleeves of his oversized gray sweatshirt, a hand-me-down from a church donation bag that hung on his slight frame like a shroud, extended well past his wrists, carefully concealing the roadmap of scars that marked his forearms like a constellation of cruelty. Some of the marks were pink and faded, souvenirs from months of careful healing hidden beneath long sleeves and creative excuses. Others were still tender and raw, the angry red of fresh burns that Derek had inflicted just 3 days earlier, with the glowing tip of his Marlboro Red, each circular mark a perfect imprint of his stepfather's particular brand of discipline. Ben had learned to catalog his injuries with the detached precision of a medical examiner. The cigarette burns formed a pattern along his left forearm, 7 perfect circles in various stages of healing, each one representing a different infraction in Derek's twisted system of justice. A harsh word spoken too loudly, a glance held too long, a moment of defiance when Ben had dared to step between Derek and Luna during one of the man's alcohol-fueled rages. On his right arm, the marks told a different story. Longer, more irregular burns from the time Derek had pressed a heated butter knife against his skin, holding it there while lecturing Ben about the importance of respect and obedience. "Look, Benny!" Luna's voice carried the innocent excitement that only a 3-year-old could muster, her chubby finger pointing proudly at the purple princess whose dress now overflowed the black lines in enthusiastic violet waves. "She's pretty like... Mama!" Ben managed to smile, though the expression felt foreign on his face, like a mask that didn't quite fit. His hazel eyes, the same color as his mother's before the light had died in them, never stopped their constant vigilance, darting between Luna's animated face and the darkened hallway that led to the living room where the television flickered, with the muted glow of whatever violent action movie Derek preferred to watch while drinking his dinner. Even in this moment of seeming peace, Ben's body remained coiled like a spring, every muscle tensed and ready to react. He had learned, through painful experience, spanning the 3 years since Derek had moved in with them, that tranquility in the Harper household was as fragile as spun glass and just as likely to cut you when it shattered. "She's beautiful, Luna," he whispered, his voice carrying the forced gentleness of a child who had been stripped of his own childhood far too early. The words came out carefully modulated, pitched at exactly the right volume to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the living room. "But remember what we talked about? We need to use our quiet voices when we're coloring, especially when Derek's home." Luna nodded solemnly, her blonde curls, so much lighter than Ben's mousy brown hair, a testament to their different fathers, bouncing as she pressed her lips together in an exaggerated display of being quiet. Her green eyes, bright and curious, in the way that only a child's could be, reflected a wisdom that no 3-year-old should possess. At her tender age, she was already learning the unspoken rules that governed their existence: when to whisper, when to hide, when to become invisible, when to run. The fact that she was learning these lessons at all was a testament to the twisted reality that had become their normal, a childhood education in survival that would mark her for life. Ben watched his sister's face as she carefully selected a pink crayon for Cinderella's shoes, noting the way she unconsciously glanced toward the living room before making any noise, the way her small body tensed at the slightest sound from elsewhere in the house. He wondered sometimes if Luna would remember any of this when she grew up, or if her mind would mercifully blur the details of these early years into a vague sense of unease. He hoped for the latter, even as he knew that forgetting would mean forgetting him too, forgetting how he had tried to protect her when no one else would. Their mother, Rachel Harper, moved through the kitchen like a specter, her once vibrant, auburn hair now dull and lifeless, pulled back in a messy ponytail that couldn't quite hide the yellowing bruise near her left temple, a souvenir from Derek's latest lesson about the importance of having dinner ready on time. At 32, she looked a decade older, her green eyes hollow and distant as she mechanically prepared dinner with the robotic efficiency of someone going through familiar motions, while her mind retreated to safer places. The foundation she had carefully applied that morning, using techniques learned from YouTube tutorials about covering bruises, could not completely mask the finger-shaped marks around her throat. 5 distinct purple ovals where Derek's hand had closed around. Her windpipe 2 nights ago, teaching her about the consequences of questioning his authority. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone whose ribs ached with every breath, whose body had become a catalog of hidden injuries that she explained away to concerned neighbors and well-meaning friends with increasingly creative stories about her own clumsiness. Rachel wore a long-sleeved blue sweater despite the kitchen's warmth, the fabric carefully chosen to hide the hand-shaped bruises on her upper arms and the belt-shaped welt across her back. Her wedding ring, the thin gold band that Derek had given her in a courthouse ceremony that felt like a lifetime ago, hung loose on her finger, her weight loss making even that small symbol of their union feel like another prison shackle threatening to slip away. Ben watched his mother from the corner of his eye, noting how she flinched when the old house creaked, how her hands trembled as she opened a can of Campbell's tomato soup. Derek's favorite, the only brand he would tolerate, served at exactly the right temperature or else. He could see the careful choreography of her movements, the way she had learned to anticipate Derek's needs and preferences, the exhausting dance of appeasement that never quite succeeded in preventing the next explosion of violence. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, to somehow find the words that would bring back the mother who used to sing while she cooked, who used to read him bedtime stories and tuck him in with kisses and promises that tomorrow would be better. But those words felt hollow, even in his own mind, lies that would crumble the moment they hit the air. How could he promise his mother safety when he couldn't even protect himself? How could he offer hope when he was just a 10-year-old boy whose own body bore the evidence of his powerlessness? The sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch caused all three of them to freeze simultaneously, their bodies responding to the stimulus with the practiced terror of prey animals sensing a predator's approach. Rachel's hand stilled on the can opener, her knuckles going white as she gripped the metal tool like a weapon. Luna's crayon stopped mid-stroke, her small hand trembling slightly as she looked to Ben for reassurance. Ben's entire body went rigid, his ears straining to identify the approaching presence, cataloging the familiar rhythm of Derek's gait. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The deliberate, measured walk of a man who knew he owned everything within these walls and everyone who lived here. Derek's key scraped against the lock with more force than necessary, the metal grinding against metal in a way that spoke of barely controlled aggression. The sound was followed by the slam of the front door that made Luna jump and clutch Ben's arm with fingers that dug into his flesh like tiny claws. The sound reverberated through the house like a gunshot, rattling the windows and causing the overhead light fixture to sway slightly, carrying with it an unspoken message that needed no translation. The master of the house had returned from another day of commanding grown men and heavy machinery, and everyone within these walls existed solely at his discretion. Rachel. Derek's voice boomed from the entryway, already carrying an edge of irritation that made Ben's stomach clench with familiar dread. The tone promised violence, threatened consequences for infractions not yet committed, but inevitable nonetheless. "Where the hell did you put my work boots? I've told you 1,000 goddamn times. They go by the back door." Rachel's response was immediate and submissive, her voice barely above a whisper, carefully modulated to convey respect and deference without seeming sarcastic or challenging. "They're by the back door, Derek. In the mudroom, just like always. Right where you left them this morning." The sound of Derek's heavy work boots against the hardwood floor grew closer, each footfall like a countdown to an explosion that Ben knew was inevitable. The boots, steel-toed Timberlands that had kicked him in the ribs more times than he could count, created a percussion of approaching doom that seemed to echo through Ben's bones. He had learned to read the signs in those footsteps, the particular cadence that meant Derek was looking for a reason to unleash his rage, the deliberate heaviness designed to announce his presence and dominance, the way the sound changed when he'd been drinking versus when he was merely exhausted and looking for someone weaker to absorb his frustrations. Derek Walsh filled the kitchen doorway like a thundercloud, his imposing 6'3" frame blocking out the light from the hallway and casting the room into deeper shadow. His presence seemed to suck the oxygen from the air, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder to do anything but focus on survival. His weathered face, permanently tanned from years of outdoor construction work, was set in the perpetual scowl that had become his default expression, a mask of contempt and barely controlled fury that he wore like armor against a world that had somehow failed to recognize his inherent superiority. His dark hair was still damp with sweat from his day wielding heavy machinery and commanding the crew of men who worked under him, and his clothes carried the familiar scent of concrete dust, diesel, fuel, and the particular breed of masculine aggression that clung to him like cologne. His work shirt, a faded blue denim with his name embroidered over the pocket, was stained with grease and sweat, and his jeans bore the scars of a dozen construction sites. But it was his hands that drew Ben's attention, those massive, calloused hands that could crush a man's throat or snap a child's arm with equal ease, hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply to cause maximum pain without leaving marks that might raise uncomfortable questions. Derek's pale blue eyes swept the kitchen with the calculating gaze of a predator surveying his territory, taking in every detail, cataloging potential infractions and excuses for the violence that seemed to simmer just beneath his skin like magma waiting to erupt. Those eyes lingered on the coloring book, the scattered crayons, the domestic scene of apparent normalcy that he seemed to view as a personal affront to his authority. Ben instinctively moved closer to Luna, his arm sliding protectively around her small shoulders in a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. The 3-year-old seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. her bright chatter dying away as she pressed herself against her big brother's side, seeking the protection that he had always provided even when he was powerless to protect himself. Even at her tender age, she had learned to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, the subtle changes in air pressure that preceded Derek's explosions of violence. "Well, well," Derek said, his voice carrying a false joviality that was somehow more terrifying than outright anger. The tone was carefully modulated, designed to lull his victims into a false sense of security before the trap snapped shut. "Look at this cozy little scene. My family, all gathered together like some goddamn Norman Rockwell painting." He moved into the kitchen with the predatory grace of a man who knew he held absolute power over everyone in the room, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor with military precision. Rachel continued stirring the soup with mechanical precision, her shoulders hunched as if she could make herself smaller, less noticeable, less likely to draw the lightning that was always threatening to strike. But Derek's attention had already shifted to Ben and Luna, his pale eyes lingering on them with an intensity that made Ben's skin crawl with invisible insects of terror. "Benjamin," Derek said, the boy's full name rolling off his tongue like a curse, each syllable weighted with years of accumulated resentment and barely contained violence. "Still playing house with your little sister, I see. When I was your age, I was helping my old man fix engines, learning what it meant to be a man, understanding the difference between work and play. But here you are, playing with dolls and crayons, like some kind of—" The insult hung unfinished in the air, but Ben knew exactly what Derek was implying. He had heard it all before. The casual cruelty disguised as concern for Ben's development, the constant undermining of his confidence couched in terms of masculine improvement, the systematic destruction of his self-worth presented as character building. Derek had elevated psychological torture to an art form, always careful to hurt in ways that wouldn't leave visible marks, at least not where teachers or neighbors might see them. "He's just helping me color, Daddy Derek," Luna said in her small voice, the title Derek had insisted she use grating against Ben's ears like nails on a chalkboard. The words came out carefully, respectfully, the way Derek had taught her through. A combination of rewards and punishments that Ben preferred not to think about. "Benny makes the pictures pretty." Derek's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, revealing teeth that were stained yellow from years of chain smoking and too much coffee. "Is that right, sweetheart? Well, maybe Benny needs to learn that there are more important things in life than making pictures pretty. Maybe he needs to learn what real responsibility looks like, what it means to be useful instead of decorative." Ben felt his heart rate spike, recognizing the tone that preceded Derek's lessons. Those sessions that always started with seemingly reasonable critiques of Ben's behavior or character, escalating gradually until Derek found justification for whatever punishment he had already decided to inflict. The pattern was as predictable as it was terrifying. Philosophical discussions about masculinity and responsibility that devolved into physical demonstrations of power and pain, always presented as necessary education for Ben's own good. Ben began, but Derek's raised hand silenced him immediately, the gesture carrying the weight of 3 years of conditioning. "I wasn't talking to you, boy. Children speak when they're spoken to, remember? That's one of the first lessons my father taught me, back when fathers actually raised their sons to be men, instead of coddling them like precious little flowers." The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle bubbling of the soup on the stove, and the distant murmur of the television from the living room. Rachel's stirring had become more frantic, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden spoon like a lifeline, the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Ben could see the tension in every line of her body, the way she held herself ready to intervene if necessary, even though they all knew such intervention would only make things worse for everyone involved. Derek pulled out one of the kitchen chairs with deliberate slowness, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. He settled his massive frame into the seat, bringing himself closer to eye level with the children, but somehow making his presence even more intimidating. The chair creaked under his weight, and Ben found himself calculating the distance to the back door, measuring the angles and obstacles between Luna's position and the nearest exit, a habit that had become as automatic as breathing. "You know what I've been thinking about all day?" Derek asked, his voice taking on the conversational tone that Ben had learned to fear most of all. It was the voice Derek used when he was planning something particularly creative, when he had spent hours at the construction site, devising new ways to assert his dominance over his family. "I've been thinking about trust, about how important it is for a family to trust each other, to be honest with each other, to not keep secrets that could tear the whole thing apart." Ben's blood turned to ice water in his veins, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that he was certain Derek could hear it. The hidden smartphone, carefully concealed beneath the loose floorboard under his bed, suddenly felt like it was burning a hole through the ceiling and into Derek's consciousness. For 3 months, Ben had been painstakingly documenting the evidence of their abuse, photographing his healing burns when Derek wasn't home, recording Luna's fearful whimpers after particularly violent episodes, capturing video footage of Rachel's injuries and Derek's threats, building a case that he hoped might someday set them free. The phone itself was a miracle of persistence and desperation. Ben had discovered it 3 months ago in Derek's truck, apparently forgotten after falling between the seats during one of Derek's many stops at various bars around town. The screen was cracked, the battery barely held a charge, and the case was held together with electrical tape, but it was functional enough for Ben's purposes. He had managed to find a compatible charging cable at school, sneaking it home in his backpack and hiding it with the phone beneath the floorboard that he had carefully loosened over weeks of patient work. Because when family members keep secrets, Derek continued, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on Ben's face with the intensity of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. When they sneak around and do things they shouldn't be doing, when they betray the trust that holds a family together, well, that's when everything falls apart. That's when people get hurt. Luna, sensing the growing tension but unable to understand its source, began to squirm in her chair. Her small hand reached for Ben's, seeking the comfort and protection that her big brother had always provided, the anchor that kept her safe in a world that seemed designed to hurt small children. Ben squeezed her fingers gently, trying to project a calm he didn't feel while his mind raced through possibilities. Had Derek found the phone? Had someone seen Ben using it during the precious few minutes when Derek was out and Rachel was distracted? Had he made some mistake, left some evidence that would cost them everything? The documentation on that phone represented months of careful planning and incredible risk. Ben had learned Derek's schedule with military precision, knowing exactly when the man left for work, when he stopped at Mickey's Tavern for his after-work drinks, when he would return home spoiling for a fight. During those brief windows of opportunity, Ben would retrieve the phone and methodically document their reality, photographing burn marks and bruises, recording Derek's drunken threats and Rachel's muffled sobs, creating a digital record of their nightmare that he hoped would someday convince someone in authority to help them. "Derek, dinner's almost ready," Rachel said suddenly, her voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade. The words came out steady despite the tremor in her hands, a desperate attempt to redirect Derek's attention away from whatever game he was playing with Ben. "Why don't you go wash up? The soup will be done in just a few minutes, and I made those grilled cheese sandwiches you like." For a moment, the kitchen balanced on a knife's edge. Derek's attention shifted to his wife, and Ben saw something flicker in the man's eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the momentary consideration of whether to redirect his focus to a different target. Rachel stood frozen at the stove, her back turned, but her entire body radiating tension, as if she could feel Derek's gaze boring into her like a physical weight. "That's a good idea," Derek said finally, rising from his chair with fluid grace that belied his size. The movement was controlled, deliberate, like a cat stretching before pouncing on its prey. "I think I will go get cleaned up, wash off the honest sweat of a real day's work, unlike some people in this house who spend their time on useless nonsense." He paused at the kitchen doorway, his massive frame filling the space as he turned back to face Ben. The smile on his face was cold and predatory, promising pain and suffering with the certainty of a death sentence. But this conversation isn't over, Benjamin. Not by a long shot. We'll be having a little heart-to-heart later tonight, just you and me. Man to man, father to son. It's time. You learned some important lessons about loyalty, about respect, about what happens to little boys who think they're smarter than their elders. The promise in those words made Ben's stomach churn with dread. Derek's man-to-man conversations inevitably took place in the basement, where the concrete walls muffled sound, and the isolation amplified every form of cruelty the man could devise. The basement where Derek kept his special tools, the extension, cords and wire hangers and other implements of education that left marks in places no one would ever see. But Ben forced himself to nod, knowing that any sign of fear or defiance would only make the inevitable punishment worse. As Derek's footsteps faded up the stairs toward the bathroom, the kitchen's atmosphere shifted subtly. Rachel's shoulders sagged with momentary relief, and Luna immediately began chattering again, her 3-year-old attention span having already moved past the uncomfortable moment to focus on her coloring once more. But the reprieve was temporary, and they all knew it. Ben remained frozen in place, his mind racing through the implications of Derek's words, and the growing certainty that tonight would bring a reckoning that could destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. The man suspected something. That much was clear. Whether he had concrete evidence or was simply fishing remained to be seen. But Ben knew from bitter experience that Derek's suspicions alone were enough to trigger an explosion of violence that could destroy everything Ben had worked so hard to protect. The damaged smartphone hidden beneath his floorboard contained 3 months' worth of carefully documented evidence. Photographs of burn marks in various stages of healing, audio recordings of Derek's threats and Rachel's muffled sobs, video footage of Luna cowering in her closet after witnessing one of Derek's rages. It represented hope, the possibility that someday the truth would set them free from this nightmare. But it also represented the most dangerous secret Ben had ever kept, and if Derek discovered it, the consequences would be unthinkable. As Luna continued coloring her princess, humming softly to herself in the innocent way that only children could manage, Ben made a silent promise. Whatever happened tonight, whatever Derek had planned for their conversation, Ben would protect his sister and preserve the evidence that might someday save them all. He was only 10 years old, but he had learned long ago that sometimes children had to be stronger than the adults who were supposed to protect them. The old house creaked around them as evening deepened into night, and Ben Harper prepared himself for another battle in a war that no child should ever have to fight. But he would fight it nonetheless because Luna's safety depended on it, because his mother's life hung in the balance, and because somewhere deep in his battered heart, he still believed that truth and courage might eventually triumph over cruelty and fear. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending the last of the autumn leaves skittering across the yard like harbingers of the storm that was about to break over the Harper household with devastating, life-changing force. The sound of Derek's shower running upstairs provided a temporary buffer of white noise that allowed the kitchen to breathe again. But Ben knew the reprieve was as fragile as morning frost. Steam began to seep from beneath the bathroom door, carrying with it the acrid scent of Derek's industrial-strength soap, the kind designed to strip away the grime and sweat of construction work, but never quite managing to wash away the stench of cruelty that seemed to permeate the man's very pores. Ben helped Luna finish coloring her princess, while his mind raced through contingency plans he prayed he would never need to use. The 3-year-old had moved on to a new page featuring Belle from Beauty and the Beast, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully selected a yellow crayon for the princess's flowing gown. The innocence of the moment felt surreal against the backdrop of impending violence, like watching someone arrange flowers while a tornado approached on the horizon. "Mama," Luna said suddenly, her voice carrying the natural curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some questions were dangerous. Why does Daddy Derek get so mad when we color? I thought grown-ups liked when kids were quiet. Rachel's stirring motion faltered for just a moment, the wooden spoon hovering motionless above the tomato soup, as she struggled to find words that could explain the inexplicable to a 3-year-old mind. Her reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who had aged decades in just a few years, her once bright eyes now hollow and haunted, her face bearing the subtle marks of someone who had learned to flinch before the blow landed. Sometimes, "Adults have bad days at work, sweetheart," Rachel said finally, her voice carefully neutral in the way that had become second nature when discussing Derek's moods. "And when they come home, they need extra quiet time to feel better." Ben wanted to scream at the lie, wanted to tear away the carefully constructed fiction that protected Luna from understanding the true nature of their situation. But he also knew that his sister's innocence was one of the few beautiful things left in their world, and preserving it for as long as possible was worth any amount of deception. At 3 years old, Luna still believed in fairy tales and happy endings, still thought that princesses always got rescued and monsters were confined to storybooks. The water stopped running upstairs, followed by the distinctive sound of Derek's heavy footsteps moving across the bathroom floor. Ben's entire body tensed involuntarily, his nervous system responding to the familiar audio cues that had become as reliable as a metronome marking time until the next explosion. Through the kitchen ceiling, they could hear Derek moving around. Their bedroom, Rachel's bedroom really, though Derek had claimed it through conquest rather than invitation, opening and closing drawers with more force than necessary. "Ben," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle bubbling of the soup. "Take Luna to her room after dinner. Read her some stories. Keep her busy. I'll try to talk to Derek, see if I can calm him down before—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Ben understood. Rachel was offering herself as a sacrifice, hoping to absorb Derek's rage before it could flow downhill to the children. It was a noble gesture born of maternal instinct, but Ben knew from bitter experience that Derek's appetite for violence was rarely satisfied by a single victim. The man seemed to feed on suffering, drawing energy from the fear and pain of others, like some kind of emotional vampire. "Mom, you don't have to," Ben began, but Rachel cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice carrying a firmness that Ben rarely heard anymore. "I'm the adult here. I'm supposed to protect you both, even if I haven't been very good at it lately." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with years of accumulated guilt and regret. Ben wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that Derek was the monster in their story, that she was as much a victim as anyone. But the words felt inadequate against the weight of their shared suffering, and before he could formulate a response, Derek's voice boomed from upstairs with the force of a thunderclap. "Rachel, where the hell is my good shirt? The blue one with the buttons?" Rachel's response was immediate and reflexive, her voice pitched to carry through the house without seeming to shout. "It's in the closet, Derek. On the right side, next to your work shirts. I'm looking in the goddamn closet, and I don't see it." Ben could hear the dangerous edge creeping into Derek's voice, the particular tone that preceded his most violent episodes. Rachel set down the wooden spoon and wiped her hands on a dish towel, her movements sharp and efficient, as she prepared to climb the stairs and locate the missing shirt, before Derek's frustration could metastasize into something worse. "I'll be right back," she murmured to Ben. But before she could move toward the stairs, Derek's voice exploded through the house like a sonic boom. "Forget it. I found the goddamn thing. But this is exactly what I'm talking about, Rachel. This house is a disaster. Nothing where it's supposed to be. Kids running wild. No respect for order or discipline." Each word hit like a physical blow, and Ben instinctively pulled Luna closer to his side. The 3-year-old had gone very still, her crayon frozen halfway to the coloring book as her developing survival instincts kicked in. At 3 years old, she couldn't understand the words, but she could read the emotional weather patterns that governed their household with the accuracy of a barometric pressure gauge. Derek's footsteps thundered down the stairs, each impact seeming to shake the entire house. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, Ben felt his breath catch in his throat. Derek had changed into his good shirt, the blue button-down that he wore to parent-teacher conferences and court appearances, occasions that required him to present the facade of respectability that fooled so many people who didn't have to live with him behind closed doors. But it was Derek's eyes that made Ben's stomach drop into his shoes. They held a particular gleam that Ben had learned to recognize and fear, the look of a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. Derek's pale blue eyes swept the kitchen with predatory calculation, taking in every detail as if he were memorizing the scene for some future purpose. "Dinner ready yet?" Derek asked, his voice deceptively casual, as he moved to the refrigerator and extracted a can of Budweiser. The familiar hiss of the pop-top. Opening sounded like the safety being removed from a grenade. "I'm starving. Been thinking all day about coming home to a nice, peaceful family dinner." The emphasis he placed on the word peaceful made it sound like a threat rather than a desire. Rachel hurried to serve the soup into mismatched bowls, her movements quick and nervous as she tried to anticipate Derek's needs before he could find fault with her efficiency. Ben noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she ladled the hot soup, sending small ripples across the surface of the tomato-red liquid. "Luna, sweetheart, put your crayons away," Rachel said, her voice carrying artificial cheer that fooled no one. "Time for dinner." Luna began gathering her coloring supplies with the methodical care of a child who had learned that leaving toys scattered could result in consequences that extended far beyond simple cleanup duty. Ben helped her stack the crayons in their battered box, hyper-aware of Derek's presence looming over them like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. Derek settled into his chair at the head of the table, the position he had claimed through intimidation rather than tradition, and took a long pull from his beer. The cold liquid seemed to do nothing to cool his simmering anger. If anything, the alcohol appeared to be stoking the fire that burned behind his eyes. He watched Ben and Luna with the calculating gaze of a predator studying potential prey, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained energy looking for an outlet. "So, Benjamin," Derek said conversationally as Rachel placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of him. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. About trust, about honesty, about the importance of family loyalty." Ben's spoon trembled slightly as he lifted it to his mouth, the tomato soup suddenly tasting like liquid fear. He forced himself to swallow, knowing that any sign of nervousness would only encourage Derek's predatory instincts. Luna sat beside him, unconsciously mirroring his careful movements as she ate her soup with the concentration of a surgeon performing delicate operations. "I think it's time we had a serious discussion about what it means to be part of this family," Derek continued, his voice growing slightly louder with each word. "About respect, about rules, about the consequences of breaking those rules." Rachel set down her own spoon with hands that shook visibly. "Derek, maybe we could talk about this after the children are in bed. Luna's had a long day and I wasn't talking to you," Derek snapped, his voice cutting through Rachel's words like a blade. "I was talking to my stepson, the boy who seems to think he's old enough to make his own decisions about what's appropriate behavior in my house." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. Ben could feel Luna's small hand creeping toward his under the table, seeking the comfort and protection that he had always provided. But for the first time in his life, Ben wasn't sure he could protect anyone, not Luna, not his mother, not even himself. "Derek, please," Rachel tried again, her voice carrying a note of desperation that made Ben's heart ache. "The children are eating. Can't we just have a peaceful dinner?" Derek's laugh was like broken glass scraping against concrete. "Peaceful? You want peaceful? You know what would be peaceful, Rachel? If people in this house actually followed the rules. If they respected authority. If they didn't sneak around doing things they shouldn't be doing." As if choreographed by some malevolent force, Derek's eyes locked onto Ben's face with laser intensity. The boy felt exposed, vulnerable, as if Derek could see straight through his skin to the secrets hidden beneath. The smartphone, tucked safely beneath his bedroom floorboard, suddenly felt like it was broadcasting its location with neon signs and air raid sirens. "You know what I found today, Benjamin?" Derek asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "I found something very interesting in my truck, something that used to be there but isn't there anymore." Ben's heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity before slamming back to life with the force of a sledgehammer. His mouth went dry as desert sand, and he could taste copper pennies on his tongue, the flavor of pure, undiluted terror. Derek knew. Somehow, impossibly, Derek had figured out that Ben had taken the phone. I don't know what you mean," Ben managed to whisper. The words coming out cracked and broken. Derek's smile was the most frightening thing Ben had ever seen. "Don't you? Are you sure about that, son? Because I'm thinking maybe your memory needs a little refreshing. Maybe you need some help remembering things you might have forgotten to mention." Rachel half rose from her chair, maternal instinct overriding self-preservation. "Derek, whatever you think Ben did, I'm sure there's an explanation. He's just a child." "Sit down," Derek roared, his voice exploding through the kitchen with enough force to rattle the windows. Luna began to cry, her small sobs cutting through, the tension like knife wounds. "This is between me and the boy. This is about lessons that should have been learned a long time ago." Derek stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire kitchen, blocking out the light and leaving them all in shadow. Ben could see the veins standing out on Derek's neck, could smell the alcohol on his breath mixing with the lingering scent of industrial soap and masculine rage. "Rachel, take Luna upstairs," Derek said, his voice carrying the cold finality of an execution order. "Now, the boy and I need to have a private conversation." "No," Rachel said, the word coming out stronger than Ben had. "Heard her speak in years. I won't let you hurt him. Not again. Not anymore." For a moment, the kitchen was frozen in tableau, Derek towering over them like an avenging angel, Rachel standing protectively near her children, Ben desperately calculating escape routes while Luna cried softly into her hands. The moment stretched taut as a wire, vibrating with the potential for explosive violence. Then Derek moved with the lightning speed of a striking snake. His hand shot out and grabbed Rachel by the throat, his massive fingers closing around her. Windpipe, with practiced efficiency. She made a strangled sound, her hands clawing uselessly at his wrist as he lifted her slightly off the ground. "You don't tell me what I can and cannot do in my own house," Derek growled, his face inches from Rachel's. "You don't protect anyone from anything. You're nobody, Rachel. You're nothing. And if you ever try to interfere with my parenting, again, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your very short life." Ben launched himself from his chair without thinking, his 10-year-old body moving on pure instinct to protect his mother. "Let her go," he screamed, grabbing Derek's arm with both hands and trying to pull him away from Rachel. "Let her go! You're hurting her!" Derek backhanded Ben with his free hand, the blow sending the boy sprawling across the kitchen floor. Stars exploded behind Ben's eyes, and he tasted blood where his teeth had cut the inside of his cheek. But even as pain shot through his skull, he could hear Luna's terrified screaming and his mother's desperate gasps for air. "You want to play hero, boy?" Derek snarled, releasing Rachel so suddenly that she crumpled to the floor beside the stove. "You want to stick your nose where it doesn't belong? Fine. Let's see how heroic you feel when you're explaining to the police why you've been taking pictures of yourself, making up stories about abuse, trying to get attention by pretending to be hurt." The words hit Ben like physical blows. Derek knew about the photos. Somehow, impossibly, he had discovered Ben's careful documentation, his evidence, his only hope for escape. But as Derek advanced toward him, Ben realized with crystal clarity that Derek's knowledge was incomplete. The man thought Ben had been fabricating evidence, creating fake injuries for sympathy rather than documenting real abuse. That's not, Ben began, but Derek cut him off with a vicious kick to his ribs that drove all the air from his lungs. Shut up. I know what you've been doing, you little freak. Taking pictures, making recordings, probably planning to show them. To some teacher or social worker, spin some sob story about how mean your stepfather is. Well, let me tell you something about real consequences, Benjamin. Let me show you what actual discipline looks like. Derek grabbed Ben by the front of his sweatshirt and hauled him to his feet with one hand. The man's strength was terrifying. Ben felt like a rag doll in Derek's grip, completely powerless to resist as he was dragged toward the basement door. Behind them, Rachel was struggling to her feet, her voice hoarse and damaged as she pleaded for Derek to stop. "Derek, please, he's just a child. Whatever you think he did, we can talk about it. Please don't hurt him." But Derek was beyond reasoning, beyond mercy. He wrenched open the basement door, the hinges screaming in protest, and Ben caught a glimpse of the concrete steps descending into darkness. The basement, Derek's private domain, where no one could hear, where no one would interfere, where Derek could teach his lessons without interruption. In that moment of absolute terror, Ben made a decision that would change everything. As Derek prepared to drag him down into the basement, Ben twisted in the man's grip and did the only thing he could think of. He bit Derek's wrist as hard as he could, his teeth sinking into flesh until he tasted blood. Derek roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough for Ben to tear free. The boy stumbled backward, his mind racing with desperate calculations. The basement meant certain agony, possibly death. The front door was too far away, and Derek would catch him before he could reach it. But the kitchen window, the one that faced the side yard, the one Derek never bothered to lock because it was too high for a child to reach normally, might offer a chance. "You little animal," Derek snarled, clutching his bleeding wrist. "I'm going to teach you lessons you'll never forget." Ben didn't wait to hear the rest of the threat. He grabbed Luna from her chair, ignoring her terrified protests, and ran toward the counter beneath the kitchen window. Behind him, he could hear Derek's heavy footsteps, could hear Rachel screaming for them to stop, could hear the crash of furniture as Derek knocked over chairs in his pursuit. The kitchen chair was heavy, but adrenaline gave Ben strength he didn't know he possessed. He dragged it to the window and climbed up. Luna clutched against his chest like a life preserver. She was crying hysterically, her small hands clinging to his sweatshirt as he fumbled with the window latch. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" Derek's voice was right behind them now, close enough that Ben could feel the man's breath on his neck. "There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You're going to learn your lesson whether you like it or not." The window latch finally gave way, and Ben pushed the glass panel open with enough force to crack it against the frame. Cold November air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of freedom and the terrifying possibility of escape. Below them lay the side yard, brown grass and fallen leaves providing a softer landing than the concrete basement floor. "Luna, hold on tight," Ben whispered into his sister's ear. "We're going to jump, and then we're going to run as fast as we can." But before he could move, Derek's massive hand closed around his ankle with crushing force. Ben felt himself being pulled backward, away from the window, away from escape, back toward the basement and whatever horrors awaited them there. In desperation, Ben grabbed the first thing his hands could find, a heavy ceramic salt shaker from the windowsill. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he hurled it at Derek's face with all the strength his 10-year-old body could muster. The salt shaker struck Derek in the forehead with a wet thud, and the man stumbled backward, cursing and bleeding. It was only a momentary distraction, but it was enough. Ben pulled his ankle free and pushed himself and Luna through the window, both of them tumbling into the cold November night, like falling stars escaping a dying world. They hit the ground hard, Ben twisting his body to absorb most of the impact and protect Luna from the worst of the fall. Pain shot through his shoulder and ribs, and he could feel new cuts opening where the broken window glass had caught his arms. But they were outside. They were free. And somewhere in the chaos of their escape, Ben had managed to grab the most important thing of all. The smartphone, retrieved from beneath his floorboard during Derek's brief distraction, was clutched in his bleeding hand like a talisman of hope. 3 months of careful documentation, dozens of photographs and recordings that proved the truth of their situation. Evidence that could finally set them free if they could just get it to the right people. "Benny!" Luna sobbed, her small body shaking with cold and terror. "I'm scared. I want Mama." "I know, baby," Ben whispered, struggling to his feet and pulling Luna into his arms. "I know you're scared, but we have to run now. We have to get help." Behind them, Derek's roar of rage echoed through the broken window like the howl of a wounded beast. Ben could hear him crashing through the house, could hear Rachel screaming, could hear the sound of violence that meant their window of opportunity was closing fast, with Luna clinging to his neck and the smartphone pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. Ben Harper began to run through the November darkness toward the distant glow of streetlights and the hope of salvation. Behind them, the house at 247 Maple Street burned with the light of Derek's fury, but ahead lay the possibility of rescue, of justice, of a world where 10-year-old boys didn't have to fight wars that adults had started. The gravel of the driveway cut through Ben's thin sneakers as he ran, each step sending jolts of pain through his injured body. But he kept running, kept moving toward the main road where cars might pass, where someone might stop, where help might finally come. Luna's weight in his arms felt like carrying hope itself, and the smartphone in his pocket contained 3 months of truth that no amount of Derek's manipulation could explain away. As they reached the edge of Maple Street, Ben could see headlights. Approaching in the distance, twin beams of light cutting through the darkness like angels coming to earth. Behind them, the front door of their house slammed open, and Derek's voice carried across the night air like thunder. "Benjamin! Luna! Get back here right now! You can't run from me! There's nowhere to go! Nowhere to hide!" But Ben was no longer listening to Derek's threats. He was watching those approaching headlights, calculating distance and speed, preparing to step into the road and trust their lives to the kindness of strangers. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. As the truck's headlights grew brighter, Ben raised his bleeding arms and stepped into the path of salvation. Luna clutched protectively against his chest, and the evidence of their suffering burning like a secret flame in his pocket. Whatever happened next, they had escaped. They had survived. And for the first time in 3 years, Ben Harper allowed himself to believe that morning might actually come. The 18-wheeler's air brakes hissed like a dragon settling onto its treasure as Michael Torres brought the massive rig to a complete stop on the shoulder of Maple Street. The truck's chrome bumper gleamed under the streetlights, and the familiar logo of Torres Transport, a family business started by Michael's father 30 years ago, caught the amber glow like a beacon of hope in the Connecticut darkness. Michael had been driving trucks for 23 years, crisscrossing the country with loads of everything from furniture to frozen foods, and in all that time, he had never seen anything quite like the sight that now filled his headlights. 2 small figures stood in the middle of the road like ghosts materialized from the November night. A boy who couldn't be more than 10 years old carrying what appeared to be a toddler, both of them swaying on their feet as if they might collapse at any moment. At first glance, Michael's trucker instincts kicked in, and he scanned the immediate area for signs of a vehicle accident. The absence of twisted metal, skid marks, or emergency flares confused him. Where were their parents? Where was the car they should have been riding in? What were 2 small children doing alone on a residential street at 8:30 on a November evening, when the temperature was already dropping toward freezing? As Michael climbed down from his cab, his steel-toed boots hitting the asphalt with solid thuds, the full extent of the children's condition became horrifyingly clear. The boy, thin and small for his age, with sandy brown hair that hung in his eyes, was bleeding from multiple cuts on his arms and face. His gray sweatshirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing what looked like older injuries beneath, and his hands shook as he clutched the toddler against his chest like she was the most precious thing in the world. The little girl, probably 3, Years old, wore only a thin nightgown that provided no protection against the cold. Her blonde curls were tangled with leaves and debris, and her green eyes were wide with terror as she sobbed into the boy's shoulder. Both children were barefoot, their feet cut and bleeding from running across gravel and broken pavement. Jesus Christ, Michael whispered under his breath, his weathered face reflecting the horror of what he was seeing. At 45 years old, he had 3 children of his own back home in Houston, and the sight of these 2 battered kids activated every protective instinct he possessed. "Hey there," he called out softly, approaching them with the careful movements of someone who understood that frightened children could bolt like startled deer. "My name's Michael. Are you kids hurt? Where are your parents?" The boy's response was to take a step backward, his hazel eyes darting between Michael's face and the truck behind him. Even in his obvious distress, the child was calculating escape routes, weighing the danger of this new adult against whatever threat had driven them out into the night. The level of wariness in those young eyes spoke of experiences no child should ever have. "Please," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying a weight of desperation that made Michael's heart clench. "We need help. Can you call the police?" The simple request hit Michael like a physical blow. Whatever had happened to these children, it was serious enough that a 10-year-old boy was specifically asking for police intervention. Michael's training as a volunteer EMT during his younger years kicked in, and he began mentally cataloging injuries while maintaining the calm, steady demeanor that had served him well in countless emergency situations. "Of course I can call the A." "Police," Michael said, pulling his cell phone from his jacket pocket. "But first, let me help you both get warm. You're freezing out here." Michael returned to his truck and retrieved the heavy wool blanket he kept behind the driver's seat, a remnant from his military days that had saved him during countless cold nights sleeping in truck stops across the country. The blanket smelled of diesel fuel and road dust, but it was clean and warm, and he wrapped it carefully around both children. "What are your names?" Michael asked gently as he settled into a crouch that brought him to the children's eye level. "I'm Michael Torres. I drive trucks all over the country, and I have 3 kids of my own back home in Texas." The boy studied Michael's face for a long moment, as if searching for signs of deception or danger. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful articulation of a child who had learned to choose his words with adult precision. "I'm Ben," he said quietly. "This is my sister Luna. She's 3. I'm 10. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Our stepfather, he was hurting us. We had to run." The simple statement contained volumes of suffering, and Michael felt rage building in his chest like steam in a pressure cooker. He had seen the aftermath of domestic violence during his EMT days, had witnessed the particular kind of evil that turned homes into war zones and children into casualties. But seeing it firsthand, looking into the eyes of a 10-year-old boy who had been forced to become his sister's protector, ignited a fury that Michael struggled to contain. "You did the right thing, Ben," Michael said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "You were very brave to get Luna away from there. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt either of you while I'm here." Luna had stopped crying and was now peering at Michael with the curious intensity that only small children could muster. Her green eyes, so similar to her brother's, held none of Ben's wariness. At 3 years old, she still possessed the innate trust that older children learn to abandon for survival. "Are you a good guy?" Luna asked in her small voice, the question carrying the simple directness that made Michael's throat tighten with emotion. "I try to be, sweetheart," Michael replied, managing a gentle smile. "I promise I'm going to help. You and your brother." Ben's grip on Luna loosened slightly, but Michael could see that the boy remained coiled for flight, ready to grab his sister and run at the first sign of danger. The level of hypervigilance in someone so young was heartbreaking, a testament to the chronic trauma that had shaped his developing nervous system. "Ben," Michael said carefully, "I need to call 911 and get some help out here. Paramedics, police officers, people who can make sure you and Luna are safe. Is that okay with you?" Ben nodded, but Michael caught the way the boy's hand moved protectively to his pocket, as if guarding something precious. The gesture was subtle, barely noticeable, but Michael's years of reading people, truckers, dock workers, highway patrol officers, had taught him to notice details that others might miss. Michael dialed 911 and spoke with calm efficiency to the dispatcher, providing their location and a brief description of the situation. As he talked, he kept one eye on the children and another on the street around them, watching for any signs of pursuit or additional danger. The house the children had emerged from, a modest two-story colonial about a quarter-mile down Maple Street, showed lights in the windows but no signs of immediate activity. "Help is on the way," Michael told Ben after ending the call. "Police and paramedics should be here in about 10 minutes. Can you tell me what happened? Only if you feel comfortable talking about it." Ben looked down at Luna, who had curled up against his side like a sleepy kitten. The 3-year-old's adrenaline was finally wearing off, and exhaustion was taking its place. When Ben looked back up at Michael, his young face held an expression of ancient weariness that no child should ever wear. "Derek, that's our stepfather. He found out I was taking pictures," Ben said quietly. "He got really angry. Angrier than I've ever seen him. He grabbed my mom by the throat, and when I tried to help her, he hit me. He was going to drag me down to the basement, and I knew if he got me down there, he might not let me come back up." The words came out in a rush, as if Ben had been holding them inside for so long that they demanded release. Michael listened without interrupting, his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining his calm exterior, while rage built inside him like a tsunami gathering force. "So I grabbed Luna and we went out the window," Ben continued. "I hurt my arms on the glass, but we got away. We ran as fast as we could, and then we saw your truck." Michael's EMT training had taught him to read between the lines of trauma narratives, to understand that what victims shared initially was often just the tip of an iceberg of abuse. The casual way Ben mentioned taking pictures suggested a level of premeditation and documentation that spoke of chronic, systematic violence rather than isolated incidents. "Ben," Michael said gently, "when you mentioned taking pictures, do you still have them?" Ben's hand moved instinctively to his pocket again, and this time Michael was certain the boy was protecting something significant. The child's eyes darted nervously between Michael's face and the dark street, as if he were weighing whether this stranger could be trusted with his most dangerous secret. I have a phone," Ben whispered, his voice so quiet that Michael had to lean closer to hear. "Tim, I found it in Derek's truck a few months ago. I've been taking pictures of what he does to us. I thought maybe someday if I had proof." The sentence trailed off, but Michael understood. This 10-year-old boy had been conducting his own investigation, building a case against his abuser with the methodical determination of a seasoned detective. The courage required for such an undertaking was staggering, especially considering the consequences if the perpetrator discovered the evidence. "Can I see the phone, Ben?" Michael asked carefully. "I promise I won't take it away from you or delete anything. But if you have evidence of what's been happening, it might help the police understand the situation better." Ben hesitated for a long moment, his young mind weighing the risks and benefits of sharing his secret. Luna stirred in his arms, murmuring something about princesses and cookies, and the sound of his sister's innocent voice seemed to strengthen Ben's resolve. With trembling hands, Ben pulled a battered smartphone from his pocket. The device was clearly damaged. The screen was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The case was held together with electrical tape, and the battery indicator showed it was nearly dead. But when Ben unlocked it with fingers that shook from cold and adrenaline, the screen came to life. There are a lot of pictures," Ben said quietly, "and some videos. I tried to document everything, but I had to be really careful. If Derek had caught me—" Michael's hands shook slightly as he accepted the phone. Nothing in his 23 years of driving trucks, His military service or his EMT training had prepared him for what he saw on that cracked screen. The first image was a close-up photograph of burn marks on small arms, circular patterns that were unmistakably cigarette burns, some fresh and red, others partially healed into pink scars. "Oh, God," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Ben, how long has this been going on?" "Since Derek moved in with us," Ben replied matter-of-factly. "About 3 years. It got worse after Luna was born. Derek said she was his real daughter, and that meant I had to earn my place in the family." Michael scrolled through more images, each one more horrifying than the last. Burns from heated metal objects, bruises in the shape of adult hands, photographs of Luna cowering in what appeared to be a closet, her young face streaked with tears. Videos that captured Derek's voice threatening violence, promising consequences, describing in graphic detail what would happen if Ben ever told anyone about their family discipline. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely heartbreaking. But it was also something else. It was hope. This brave, intelligent, determined 10-year-old boy had created a case file that would ensure Derek faced justice for his crimes. No amount of manipulation or gaslighting could explain away photographic evidence taken over months of systematic abuse. "Ben," Michael said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you are the bravest kid I've ever met. Do you understand that? What you did, documenting this, protecting Luna, getting her to safety. That's the kind of courage that most adults never find." Ben's response was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens approaching, their wailing growing louder as multiple emergency vehicles converged on their location. Michael could see flashing lights reflecting off the houses down the street, red and blue strobes that announced the arrival of help. But Ben's reaction to the approaching sirens was not relief. It was terror. The boy's entire body tensed, and he clutched Luna tighter against his chest, his eyes scanning the darkness as if looking for escape routes. "Hey, it's okay," Michael said quickly, recognizing the signs of a trauma response. "Those are the good guys, Ben, police and paramedics coming to help you and Luna." "But what if they don't believe us?" Ben asked, his voice cracking with fear. "What if Derek convinces them that we're lying? He's really good at making people think he's nice. What if they make us go back?" The question revealed the depth of Ben's understanding about the complexities of domestic violence cases. This 10-year-old had already grasped concepts that many adults struggled with. The way abusers could present charming facades to the outside world, the difficulty of proving abuse when the perpetrator was skilled at manipulation, the terrifying possibility that the system designed to protect children might fail them. "Ben, look at me," Michael said firmly, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You have evidence, real, undeniable evidence, photos, videos, recordings, everything you need to prove what happened. No one can argue with that. No one can make you go back to that house." The first police car arrived with a squeal of brakes, followed immediately by an ambulance and 2 more patrol units. Officers began securing the scene while paramedics approached with medical bags and warm blankets. The professional efficiency of their response was reassuring, but Michael could feel Ben's tension increasing with each new arrival. "Michael Torres," one of the officers called out, consulting notes from the 911 dispatch. "You're the one who called this in?" "That's right," Michael replied, standing but keeping one hand on Ben's shoulder. "These kids escaped from an abusive situation. The boy has been documenting evidence of the abuse. The perpetrator is likely still in the house down the street." The lead officer, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, knelt down to Ben's level with the practiced ease of someone experienced in dealing with traumatized children. "Hi there," she said gently. "I'm Officer Martinez. Can you tell me your name?" "Ben Harper," the boy replied quietly. "This is my sister Luna. Our stepfather Derek Walsh has been hurting us, and we had to run away." Officer Martinez nodded professionally, but Michael caught the flash of anger that crossed her features when she took in the children's injuries. Ben, we're going to make sure you and Luna are safe. But first, the paramedics need to check your injuries, okay? The next few minutes passed in a blur of professional activity. Paramedics carefully examined both children, documenting injuries and providing immediate medical care. Ben submitted to their ministrations with the stoic resignation of someone accustomed to pain, but he refused to let go of the smartphone, clutching it like a lifeline. Officer Martinez spoke quietly with Michael, taking down his statement and contact information. Other officers were already moving toward the house on Maple Street, preparing to make contact with Derek Walsh. The machinery of justice was grinding into motion, but Michael could see that Ben remained terrified, convinced that somehow Derek would escape consequences and return to hurt them. "Officer Martinez," Michael said quietly, "the boy has been documenting the abuse. He has photographs, videos, recordings, months of evidence, but he's afraid to show it to you because he's worried it won't be enough." The officer's expression grew grave. "Ben," she said, turning back to the boy, "if you have evidence of what happened to you and Luna, it would help us make sure Derek can never hurt you again. Would you be willing to show me what you have?" Ben looked at Michael, seeking reassurance from the only adult who had shown him kindness in recent memory. Michael nodded encouragingly, and Ben slowly held out the damaged smartphone. "There are pictures," Ben said quietly, "and videos. I tried to record everything, but I had to be careful." If Derek had found out, Officer Martinez accepted the phone with the reverence due to a piece of crucial evidence. As she scrolled through the contents, her professional composure began to crack. Michael watched her jaw clench, saw her free hand ball into a fist, witnessed the struggle to maintain objectivity in the face of such overwhelming cruelty. "Ben," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "this is exactly the kind of evidence we need. You did something incredibly brave and incredibly smart. This phone is going to help us make sure Derek goes to prison for a very long time." The words seemed to release something inside Ben, and for the first time since Michael had found them on the road, the boy began to cry, not the silent tears of survival, but the honest sobs of a child who had finally found adults willing to protect him. As Luna slept peacefully in Ben's arms, wrapped in Michael's blanket and surrounded by police officers and paramedics who had sworn to serve and protect, the first light of hope began to dawn over the nightmare that had been the Harper children's life. The evidence was undeniable, the case was solid, and for the first time in 3 years, Ben Harper allowed himself to believe that monsters could be defeated and children could be safe. In the distance, Derek Walsh was being placed in handcuffs while officers read him his rights. The house at 247 Maple Street would soon be empty of his presence, and the children who had suffered within its walls would never have to return to that particular hell again. But the real victory wasn't Derek's arrest. It was the courage of a 10-year-old boy who had refused to surrender, who had documented truth in the face of overwhelming danger, and who had risked everything to save his sister. Ben Harper had fought a war that no child should have to fight, and he had won not through violence or vengeance, but through intelligence, determination, and love. As the ambulance prepared to transport the children to the hospital for more comprehensive medical evaluation, Michael Torres felt a profound sense of honor at having played a role in their rescue. He would never see Ben and Luna again, but he would carry their story with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that heroes came in all sizes and that sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important truths. The November night that had begun with terror and desperation was ending with hope and justice. And in the back of an ambulance heading toward safety, Ben Harper finally allowed himself to close his eyes and rest, knowing that for the first time in 3 years, tomorrow would be better than today. The emergency room at Millbrook General Hospital hummed with the controlled chaos that marked the difference between crisis and catastrophe. Fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh, clinical white, making the cuts on Ben's arms appear more vivid, the exhaustion in Luna's eyes more pronounced. But for the first time in 3 years, The sterile brightness felt safe rather than threatening. A place where healing could begin and truth would be documented with medical precision. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending pediatrician on duty, had seen her share of abuse cases during her 15-year career, but the Harper children presented evidence so systematic and extensive that even her experienced eyes widened with shock. As she carefully examined Ben's injuries, cataloging each burn mark and scar for the official medical record that would become crucial evidence in Derek Walsh's prosecution, she struggled to maintain her professional composure. "Ben," Dr. Chen said gently as she photographed the constellation of cigarette burns on his left forearm, "I need you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. You did nothing wrong." Ben lay on the examination table, his small frame dwarfed by the adult-sized medical equipment around him. His hazel eyes tracked every movement in the room with the hypervigilance of a trauma survivor. But there was something different in his expression now, a gradual relaxation that came from being surrounded by adults whose job was to heal rather than harm. "Will Luna be okay?" Ben asked for the dozenth time since their arrival. Despite his own injuries, despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him, his primary concern remained his sister's welfare. "She's scared of doctors. She doesn't like when people touch her." Through the window that connected their examination rooms, Ben could see Luna being tended to by Dr. Rodriguez, a gentle pediatrician who specialized in treating traumatized children. The 3-year-old had initially screamed when separated from her brother, but the medical staff had quickly learned that keeping the siblings in adjacent rooms with visual contact was essential for both children's cooperation. "Luna is going to be just fine," Dr. Chen assured Ben. "Dr. Rodriguez is very good with little ones, and see, she's already calming down." Indeed, Luna had stopped crying and was now cautiously accepting a stuffed elephant from one of the nurses. Her blonde curls had been cleaned and combed, and someone had found her a tiny hospital gown decorated with colorful butterflies that made her look like the small child she truly was, rather than the traumatized survivor she had been forced to become. Detective James Morrison arrived at the hospital just as the medical examinations were concluding. A 20-year veteran of the force with graying temples and kind eyes that had seen too much human cruelty, Morrison specialized in cases involving crimes against children. He had reviewed the preliminary evidence from Ben's smartphone during the drive to the hospital, and what he had seen had made him pull over twice to collect himself. "Ben," Detective Morrison said, settling into a chair beside the boy's hospital bed, "I'm Detective Morrison. I investigate cases where children have been hurt, and I help make sure the people who hurt them face consequences for their actions." Ben studied the detective's face with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust adult authority figures automatically. But Morrison's calm demeanor and the way he spoke directly to Ben rather than talking over him seemed to pass some internal test. "Officer Martinez said you have lots of evidence," Ben said quietly. "Will it be enough to make sure Derek goes to prison?" "Ben," Morrison replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "what you documented on that phone is the most comprehensive evidence of systematic child abuse I've seen in 20 years of police work. You created a case file that would make seasoned detectives proud. Derek Walsh is going to prison for a very long time." The detective's words seemed to unlock something inside Ben, and his thin shoulders began to shake with silent sobs, not the desperate crying of terror, but the cleansing tears of relief that came when a burden too heavy for small shoulders was finally lifted by capable adult hands. Morrison waited patiently for Ben's emotions to stabilize before continuing. "Ben, I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight and about the pictures on your phone. I know it's difficult to talk about, but your answers will help us make sure Derek can never hurt you or Luna or anyone else ever again." For the next hour, Ben recounted his story with remarkable detail and clarity. He described Derek's escalating violence over the past 3 years, the systematic pattern of abuse that targeted him specifically while sparing Luna from the worst of it. He explained how he had discovered the damaged smartphone in Derek's truck, how he had learned to charge it at school, how he had developed a careful system for documenting evidence without detection. Morrison took notes with growing amazement at the 10-year-old's methodical approach to building a case against his abuser. Ben had cataloged dates, times, and specific incidents. He had learned to photograph injuries in good lighting, to record audio during Derek's most violent outbursts, to create a timeline that would stand up in court. "Ben, did Derek ever threaten to kill you or your family?" Morrison asked, knowing that such threats would elevate the charges from assault to terroristic threatening. "All the time," Ben replied matter-of-factly. "He said if I ever told anyone what happened in our house, he would kill me and Luna and make it look like an accident. He said no one would ever believe a kid over an adult anyway, and that foster care would be worse than anything he could do to us." Morrison's jaw clenched as he wrote down Ben's words. Derek Walsh's manipulation tactics were textbook examples of how abusers maintained control over their victims: isolation, threats, systematic undermining of their victims' belief that escape or rescue was possible. In the adjacent room, Child Protective Services caseworker Maria Santos was conducting a gentler interview with Luna, using dolls and drawings to help the 3-year-old express experiences she lacked the vocabulary to describe directly. Luna's revelations, filtered through the innocent perspective of a toddler, painted a picture of a household where violence was normalized and children learned to hide as a survival mechanism. Luna drew this picture of her family, Maria showed Morrison during a brief consultation. The drawing showed stick figures representing Ben and Luna, huddled together in what appeared to be a closet, while a much larger, darker figure loomed over them from outside. When I asked her about the big person, she said, "That's Daddy Derek when he's angry. Benny hides me when the yelling starts." The simple drawing, created by a 3-year-old's innocent hand, provided powerful corroborating evidence of Ben's testimony. It showed that Luna, despite her young age, understood the danger Derek represented and recognized Ben as her protector. Meanwhile, across town at the Millbrook police station, Derek Walsh was discovering that his usual manipulation tactics were ineffective against seasoned investigators armed with undeniable evidence. Detective Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, Morrison's partner, was conducting the interrogation with the cold professionalism of someone who had no patience for child abusers. "Derek, we have extensive photographic evidence of systematic abuse," Hayes stated flatly, sliding printed copies of selected images across the metal table. "These photos show healing patterns consistent with months of repeated cigarette burns, heated metal objects pressed against skin, and evidence of blunt force trauma. How do you explain these injuries?" Derek's initial response was predictably manipulative. He claimed Ben was a troubled child who injured himself for attention. He suggested that the boy was mentally unstable, prone to self-harm and elaborate fantasies. He painted himself as a concerned stepfather, trying to deal with a disturbed child, while supporting a struggling single mother. But Derek's carefully constructed facade began to crumble when Hayes played audio recordings from Ben's phone. Derek's own voice, threatening violence, describing in graphic detail what would happen if Ben ever told lies about their family. The recordings captured Derek's rage in its purest form, his threats delivered in language so violent and specific that no amount of backtracking could explain them away. "That's your voice, isn't it, Derek?" Hayes asked, replaying a particularly damning segment where Derek could be heard promising to break every bone in that little bastard's body if Ben continued to cause problems. Derek's lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Robert Klein, advised his client to remain silent. Klein had seen the evidence package, and he knew this case was hopeless from a defense standpoint. The documentation was too extensive, too detailed, too consistent to be fabricated. His only hope was to negotiate a plea agreement that might spare Derek a life sentence. Back at the hospital, Rachel Harper arrived in the company of 2 police officers, who had retrieved her from the basement where Derek had locked her during his final explosive confrontation with Ben. Her physical condition, bruises around her throat, a possible concussion, defensive wounds on her arms, provided additional evidence of the violence that had erupted in the Harper household that night. Rachel's reunion with her children was emotionally devastating. She collapsed beside Ben's hospital bed, sobbing apologies for her failure to protect them, begging their forgiveness for allowing Derek's abuse to continue for so long. Her guilt was palpable, but Ben's response showed the remarkable emotional maturity that trauma had forced upon him. "Mom, it's not your fault," Ben said quietly, reaching out to touch his mother's bruised face. "Derek hurt you too. You couldn't fight him by yourself, but now the police know the truth and he can't hurt any of us anymore." Dr. Martinez, the hospital's staff psychologist, observed the family reunion with professional interest. She had been called in to assess the children's immediate psychological needs and to recommend appropriate trauma counseling. What she saw in Ben's interaction with his mother was both heartbreaking and hopeful. A child who had been forced to become a protector before he could properly be protected, but who still retained the capacity for forgiveness and love. "Ben has shown remarkable resilience," Dr. Martinez later told Detective Morrison. "His systematic documentation of the abuse suggests a level of cognitive sophistication and emotional regulation that's quite extraordinary for a 10-year-old. However, he's also showing clear signs of hypervigilance, dissociation, and complex trauma responses that will require extensive therapeutic intervention." As the night wore on, the full scope of Derek Walsh's crimes began to emerge through interviews with neighbors, teachers, and family members who had suspected something was wrong but felt powerless to intervene. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who lived next door, tearfully admitted that she had often heard concerning sounds from the Harper house but hadn't known how to help. "I saw that boy outside sometimes with long sleeves even in summer," she told Officer Martinez. "And the little girl, she always seemed so quiet, so scared. I should have called someone. I should have done something." Ben's teacher, Miss Thompson, provided additional context about behavioral changes she had observed in her student over the past year. Ben's academic performance had remained strong, a testament to his intelligence and determination, but she had noticed his increasing withdrawal from social interactions, his hypervigilance during fire drills and other loud events, his reluctance to remove his sweatshirt even on warm days. "Ben is one of the brightest students I've ever taught," Miss Thompson told the investigators. "But there was something in his eyes, a sadness that no child should carry. I suspected something was wrong at home, but he never said anything, and he always had explanations for any injuries I could see." The teacher's observations reinforced the picture of Ben as an intelligent, resourceful child who had learned to hide his suffering to protect himself and his sister. His ability to maintain academic performance while enduring systematic abuse spoke to an inner strength that would serve him well in his recovery journey. As dawn began to break over Millbrook, the initial phase of the investigation was complete. Derek Walsh had been formally charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault, terroristic threatening, and unlawful imprisonment. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that the district attorney's office was already discussing additional charges that could result in a life sentence. Ben and Luna were placed in emergency protective custody while Child Protective Services worked to identify appropriate long-term placement options. The children's maternal grandmother, Dorothy Harper, who lived in rural Vermont, had been contacted and was driving through the night to reach Millbrook. Her immediate response, horror at what had happened to her grandchildren and fierce determination to protect them, suggested that she would provide the stable, loving home that Ben and Luna desperately needed. In his hospital bed, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, Ben Harper finally allowed himself to sleep deeply for the first time in months. Luna lay in a crib beside his bed, her small hand curled around the stuffed elephant the nurses had given her, her breathing steady and peaceful. Detective Morrison sat in a chair between their beds, maintaining a protective vigil that he had volunteered for without being asked. As he watched the children sleep, he marveled at their resilience and at the extraordinary courage Ben had shown in documenting their suffering and orchestrating their escape. The evidence contained on Ben's damaged smartphone would become the foundation for a case that would send Derek Walsh to prison for the rest of his life. But more importantly, it had liberated 2 children from a nightmare that no amount of adult failures or systemic inadequacies could excuse. Ben Harper had saved his sister and himself not through violence or vengeance, but through intelligence, documentation, and the unshakable belief that truth would eventually prevail over lies. As the sun rose over Millbrook General Hospital, it illuminated not just the beginning of a new day, but the start of a new life for Ben and Luna Harper, a life where children could sleep without fear, where adults worked to heal rather than harm, and where the evidence of suffering would be transformed into the foundation for justice and healing. Tui, reckoning had come at last, and for the first time in 3 years, the Harper children were truly safe. 6 months had passed since that November night when 2 children fled through a broken window into the darkness, carrying nothing but each other and a smartphone filled with evidence of their suffering. Now, as the first substantial snowfall of winter blanketed the rolling hills of rural Vermont, Ben Harper stood at the kitchen window of his grandmother's farmhouse, watching Luna chase snowflakes in the backyard with the uninhibited joy that only a 3-year-old could muster. The farmhouse at 42 Meadowbrook Lane was everything that 247 Maple Street had not been, a place where laughter echoed through rooms instead of screams, where the heavy footsteps on wooden floors belonged to a grandmother hurrying to offer cookies and hugs rather than a stepfather approaching with violence in his eyes. The old Victorian home, built in 1892 and lovingly maintained by 3 generations of Harper women, wrapped around its inhabitants like a warm embrace, its wide wraparound porch and gabled windows creating spaces for healing that Ben was only beginning to understand. Dorothy Harper, known to her grandchildren simply as Grandma Dot, moved through her kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 35 years teaching elementary school children and understood that love was best expressed through consistency, patience, and freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. At 68, she was a formidable woman with silver hair that she wore in a practical bun, laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived, and hands that had comforted countless children over the decades. "Ben, sweetheart," Grandma Dot called, from the stove where she was preparing hot chocolate. "Would you like marshmallows in yours? The little ones or the big ones?" "Little ones, please," Ben replied, though his attention remained focused on Luna, who was now attempting to catch snowflakes on her tongue while spinning in circles that sent her blonde curls flying around her face like a golden halo. The sight of his sister playing, truly playing without fear or hypervigilance, still felt miraculous to Ben, a daily reminder that children could heal when given safety and time. The transformation in Luna over the past 6 months had been remarkable. The 3-year-old who had once cowered in closets and spoke only in whispers now chattered constantly, asked endless questions about everything from why snow was white to whether angels lived in clouds, and approached each day with the boundless curiosity that was her birthright. Dr. Sarah Kim, the child psychologist who worked with Luna twice a week, described her recovery as textbook resilience, explaining that children Luna's age possessed an extraordinary capacity for healing when removed from traumatic environments and placed in consistently safe, nurturing homes. Ben's own journey toward healing had been more complex, marked by progress and setbacks that reflected the deeper psychological wounds inflicted by 3 years of systematic abuse. At 10 years old, he had developed coping mechanisms and survival strategies that served him well during the crisis, but proved challenging to unlearn in safety. He still checked all the locks in the house before bed, still positioned himself between Luna and any potential threat, still woke sometimes in the pre-dawn hours with his heart racing from nightmares that featured Derek's voice promising violence. But there were signs of hope, moments when the little boy he had never been allowed to be emerged from behind the protective walls he had built around his heart. 3 weeks ago, he had built a fort out of couch cushions in the living room and invited Luna to join him for a camping adventure, complete with flashlights and ghost stories that were more silly than scary. Last month, he had laughed. Actually, laughed at something funny on television. The sound so genuine and unexpected that Grandma Dot had stopped what she was doing just to savor the moment. "The hot chocolate is ready," Grandma Dot announced, setting 2 steaming mugs on the kitchen table beside a plate of homemade snickerdoodles. "Why don't you call Luna in before she turns into a snow woman?" Ben opened the back door and called to his sister, who came running toward the house with cheeks flushed pink from cold and eyes sparkling with delight. She burst through the door in a whirlwind of melting snow and excitement, chattering about the snow angels she was planning to make after her snack. "Grandma Dot, did you see me catching snowflakes?" Luna asked, climbing onto the chair beside Ben and reaching for a cookie. "I caught 17. Well, maybe 16. Ben, how do you count snowflakes when they melt?" "You count them in your heart," Ben replied with the gentle wisdom that had become his trademark, "where they stay forever, even after they melt." Luna accepted this explanation with the easy faith of a child who had learned to trust the adults in her life again. She dunked her cookie in her hot chocolate and began planning elaborate snow fort constructions that would require Ben's engineering expertise and Grandma Dot's architectural input. The kitchen table where they sat told its own story of healing. Unlike the scarred and damaged table in the Maple Street house, this one was smooth and well-maintained, marked only by the gentle wear of decades of family meals and homework sessions and late-night conversations over cups of tea. Grandma Dot had covered it with a cheerful red tablecloth decorated with snowflakes, and the surface was usually adorned with some evidence of her grandchildren's presence: Luna's art projects, Ben's library books, photographs from their various outings and adventures. "Ben," Grandma Dot said, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee, "I got a call from your mother this morning. She's doing very well in her program, and she wanted you both to know how proud she is of you." Rachel Harper was currently in her 4th month at Mountain View Recovery Center, a residential treatment facility in New Hampshire that specialized in helping domestic violence survivors heal from complex trauma while addressing co-occurring substance abuse issues. The path to her recovery had not been simple. 3 years of living in constant fear had left her with depression, anxiety, and a dependence on prescription medications that Derek had encouraged as a way to keep her compliant and confused. But Rachel was fighting for her sobriety and her mental health with the same determination that Ben had shown in documenting their abuse. She attended daily therapy sessions, participated in group counseling with other survivors, and worked with case managers to develop the skills she would need to rebuild her life and eventually provide a safe home for her children again. "Did she say when she might be able to visit?" Ben asked, though his tone was carefully neutral. His relationship with his mother was complicated by understanding beyond his years. He knew she had been a victim too, but he also remembered the times when her medication-induced fog had left him and Luna even more vulnerable to Derek's violence. "She's hoping to get a weekend pass next month," Grandma Dot replied gently. "But only if you and Luna feel ready for that. There's no pressure, sweetheart. You get to decide what feels safe and comfortable." This was perhaps the most significant change in Ben's life, the recognition that his feelings and preferences mattered, that adults would listen to his concerns and respect his boundaries. Dr. Michael Chen, Ben's own therapist, had worked patiently to help him understand that children should not have to make adult decisions about survival and safety, but that his insights and feelings about his own healing journey were valid and important. The legal proceedings against Derek Walsh had concluded 2 months earlier with his acceptance of a plea agreement that sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Ben had not been required to testify in person. His smartphone evidence was so comprehensive and damning that Derek's legal team advised him to accept the prosecution's offer rather than face a trial that would likely result in an even longer. Sentence District Attorney Michelle Foster had called Ben personally to inform him of the sentencing outcome. "Ben," she had said, "what you did, documenting that evidence, protecting your sister, having the courage to seek help, that changed everything. Derek Walsh will never hurt another child because of your bravery." The knowledge that Derek was locked away forever provided a foundation of safety that allowed other aspects of healing to flourish. Ben had started attending Millbrook Elementary School's satellite program in Woodstock, Vermont, where his academic gifts were recognized and nurtured by teachers who understood his background and worked to help him develop normal peer relationships. His teacher, Miss Rodriguez, had been amazed by his mature vocabulary and sophisticated reasoning skills. But she also worked to help him rediscover the simple pleasures of childhood learning, art projects that were messy and fun rather than perfect, group activities that emphasized cooperation over survival, playground games that taught him how to be silly and carefree. "Look," Luna suddenly exclaimed, pointing toward the window where large snowflakes were falling more heavily. "It's a blizzard. We can build the biggest snowman in the whole world." "After you finish your hot chocolate," Grandma Dot said with a smile, "and after you put on your snow boots and hat and mittens, we don't want you turning into an icicle." Luna giggled at the idea of becoming an icicle, then launched into an elaborate explanation of how icicles were formed and whether they could be used as magic wands. Her scientific curiosity and vivid imagination were flourishing in an environment where questions were encouraged and creativity was celebrated rather than suppressed. Ben listened to his sister's chatter while watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill, his mind drifting to thoughts of the future that had once seemed impossible to imagine. Next fall, he would start 6th grade at the local middle school, where he planned to join the chess club and maybe try out for the academic decathlon team. Luna would begin attending the preschool program at Grandma Dot's former elementary school, where she would learn to interact with other children her age and develop the social skills that isolation had prevented her from acquiring. The afternoon passed in a gentle rhythm of preparation and anticipation. Grandma Dot helped Luna into her snow gear, a bright red coat with matching hat and mittens that made her look like a cheerful cardinal against the white landscape. Ben bundled himself into the warm winter clothes that Grandma Dot had bought for him, marveling at how different it felt to wear clothing that fit properly and was chosen for comfort rather than concealment. Outside, the snow was falling steadily, transforming the already picturesque Vermont landscape into something from a fairy tale. The old maple trees that lined the driveway wore crowns of white, and the barn where Grandma Dot kept her small collection of rescue animals stood like a red beacon against the monochrome sky. "Okay, what's our plan?" Ben asked as they surveyed the backyard, automatically taking charge in the way that had become second nature during their years of survival. "First, we build the bottom," Luna announced with authority. "It has to be really, really big. Then the middle, then the head. And then we need stones for eyes and a carrot for the nose." Ben nodded seriously, appreciating Luna's systematic approach to snowman construction. Together, they began rolling the first snowball, Ben guiding Luna's efforts and adding his own strength when needed. The snow was perfect for packing. Wet, enough to hold together but not so heavy that Luna couldn't help. As they worked, Ben found himself relaxing in a way that still felt foreign and wonderful. His shoulders dropped from their habitual tension, his breathing deepened, and for long stretches of time, he forgot to scan the perimeter for potential threats. This was what safety felt like, the ability to focus completely on the present moment, to engage in activities that served no purpose beyond joy and connection. "Ben, are you happy here?" Luna asked suddenly, pausing in her snowball rolling to look up at her brother with serious green eyes. The question caught Ben off guard, with its directness and its underlying complexity. Happiness was a concept he was still learning to recognize and trust. For so long, any positive emotion had been dangerous, a sign of vulnerability that Derek could exploit, a moment of lowered guard that could result in swift punishment. "Yes," Ben said finally, surprised by the truth of it. "I think I am happy here. Are you?" "I love it here," Luna declared with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old. "Grandma Dot makes the best cookies, and my bed is soft, and you don't have to hide me anymore. I like not hiding." The simple statement hit Ben with unexpected force. For 3 years, hiding had been their primary survival strategy. Hiding from Derek's attention, hiding evidence of abuse, hiding their true feelings and needs. The fact that Luna could state so clearly that she preferred not hiding felt like a victory for normalcy and healing. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the snowman taking shape under their combined efforts. Ben found himself remembering other snow days from his early childhood, before Derek had entered their lives, when building snowmen had been about fun rather than distraction from fear. The memories were faint but precious, reminders that his life had not always been defined by survival and protection. "I think our snowman needs a name," Luna announced, as they rolled the middle section into place. "What do you think we should call him?" Ben asked. Luna considered this with the gravity of someone making a momentous decision. "How about Hope? Because he's happy, and he's not scared of anything." Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion at his sister's unconscious wisdom. Hope was indeed what they were building here. Not just a snowman, but a life where children could play without fear, where happiness was possible, where the future held promise rather than dread. "Hope is a perfect name," Ben said, helping Luna lift the head section onto their snowman. As the afternoon wore on, their snowman took shape with all the character that amateur sculptors could provide. Hope stood slightly lopsided, with mismatched stone eyes and a crooked carrot nose, arms made from fallen maple branches, and a scarf borrowed from Grandma Dot's collection. He was imperfect and wonderful, a testament to the fact that beauty could emerge from the simplest materials when crafted with love and joy. Grandma Dot appeared on the back porch as they were putting the finishing touches on their creation, her camera ready to capture the moment. "Now that's a magnificent snowman," she called out. "You two are natural artists." Luna posed proudly beside Hope, her arms spread wide as if presenting their masterpiece to the world. Ben stood beside her, his smile genuine and unguarded in a way that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. When Grandma Dot's camera clicked, it captured more than just a moment in time. It documented the victory of resilience over trauma, of love over fear, of children reclaiming their right to childhood joy. As evening approached and the snow continued to fall, they reluctantly headed inside for dinner and the warm rituals that had become their routine. Grandma Dot had prepared Ben's favorite meal, homemade, chicken and dumplings with fresh bread and green beans from her summer garden that she had frozen for winter. The kitchen filled with the sense of comfort and security, aromas that spoke of stability and care. During dinner, Luna entertained them with elaborate stories about Hope the Snowman's adventures during the night, involving conversations with rabbits and visits from snow fairies. Ben listened with the indulgent attention of an older brother who had learned to treasure his sister's imagination and creativity. Grandma Dot encouraged Luna's storytelling while gently correcting her table manners, providing the kind of consistent, patient guidance that helped children learn appropriate behavior without fear of punishment. After dinner, they gathered in the living room where a fire crackled in the old stone fireplace. Grandma Dot settled into her favorite armchair with her knitting, while Ben and Luna curled up together on the couch under a soft quilt that had been made by Ben's great-grandmother, decades earlier. The room was warm and peaceful, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that spoke of contentment rather than tension. "Grandma Dot," Luna said sleepily, "will Hope still be there tomorrow?" "He'll be there as long as the weather stays cold," Grandma Dot replied. "Snow people are very good at waiting patiently for the children who made them." Ben understood that Luna's question carried deeper meaning, a 3-year-old's way of asking whether good things were permanent, whether the safety and happiness they had found could be trusted to last. It was a question that Ben himself struggled with, though he was learning to believe that some changes were indeed permanent, that some forms of security could be counted on. As Luna dozed against his shoulder, Ben reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a 10-year-old boy carrying the weight of adult responsibilities, documenting evidence of abuse while trying to protect his sister from horrors no child should witness. Tonight, he was simply a boy sitting by a fire with his family, warm and safe and surrounded by love. The scars on his arms had faded to thin silver lines that served as reminders rather than open wounds. The hypervigilance that had once consumed His every waking moment had softened into a heightened awareness that helped him appreciate safety rather than constantly fear its loss. The smartphone that had contained their salvation now sat in an evidence locker at the Millbrook Police Department, its mission complete, its contents having fulfilled their purpose of ensuring justice and protection. "Ben," Grandma Dot said softly, "you should know how proud I am of you. What you did for Luna, the courage you showed, the way you've helped both of you heal, that's the kind of bravery that changes the world." Ben felt tears gathering in his eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than pain. For so long, he had carried the burden of being strong, of being the protector, of making decisions that no child should have to make. Now, surrounded by adults who understood their role as protectors and providers, he was slowly learning how to be a child again. Outside, Hope the snowman stood sentinel in the backyard, his mismatched features softened by the continuing snowfall. In the morning, Ben and Luna would rush to the window to check on their creation, would bundle up in warm clothes to play in the fresh snow, would continue the gentle work of building a life where children could be children, and hope was not just the name of a snowman but a daily reality. The November night that had begun their journey toward freedom felt like a lifetime ago, though Ben carried its lessons with him, the knowledge that truth was more powerful than lies, that courage could come in small packages, that children possessed a strength that adults often underestimated. But more importantly, he was learning new lessons about healing, about trust, about the possibility that even the deepest wounds could eventually transform into wisdom and compassion. As the fire died down to glowing embers and Grandma Dot quietly suggested it was time for bed, Ben carefully lifted Luna into his arms and carried her upstairs to the bedroom they shared, not out of necessity born from fear, but out of choice rooted in love and comfort. Their beds were separated by only a few feet, close enough for whispered conversations and mutual comfort, but far enough apart to allow for individual dreams and growing independence. Ben tucked Luna into her bed, her blonde hair spread across, the pillow like spun gold, her breathing deep and peaceful. He kissed her forehead gently, a gesture of protection that had evolved from desperate necessity into simple affection. "Sweet dreams, Luna," he whispered. "Hope will be waiting for us tomorrow." As Ben settled into his own bed, surrounded by the soft sounds of a house at rest, Grandma Dot's gentle movements in the kitchen, the settling of old wood, the whisper of snow against the windows, he allowed himself to feel something that had once seemed impossible: contentment. Not the fragile happiness that could be shattered by a heavy footstep or raised voice, but the deep satisfaction that came from safety, love, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for joy rather than new reasons for fear. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake unique and beautiful, covering the world in a blanket of pristine white that spoke of new beginnings and infinite possibilities. And in a warm bed in a safe house, 10-year-old Ben Harper closed his eyes and dreamed of snowmen and laughter, of a future where children could build hope out of snow and love, where courage was rewarded with healing, and where even the darkest nights eventually gave way to morning light. The boy who had once documented suffering with a damaged smartphone now lived in a world where the only evidence he needed to collect was evidence of joy. Luna's laughter echoing through the house, Grandma Dot's patient guidance, the gradual rebuilding of trust in a world that could be kind as well as cruel. And as sleep finally claimed him, Ben Harper smiled in his dreams, knowing that when morning came, Hope would still be standing in the backyard, waiting patiently for the children who had made him, a silent testimony to the triumph of love over fear, of healing over harm, of hope over despair.